Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. Today I am going to be making a batch of homemade soap. It's going to have a floral scent and be topped with dried flowers. So first I'll just go over some of the things that I have prepped here that I'll be working with. First I have a bowl of a bunch of different oils, and this is going to make up the majority of the soap. My recipe includes coconut oil, shea butter, olive oil, castor oil, and sweet almond oil, but you can customize this based on whatever butters and oils you would like to use. You just have to make sure that you calculate it properly, and I'll leave a link down below for a calculator that you can use based on whatever ingredients you choose to use. I also have a fragrance oil here. This is optional. If you are opposed to artificial fragrances, you can use essential oils, or you can just leave this out altogether and make an unscented soap. I also have a little bit of rose kaolin clay here. This is going to be a natural pink colorant for our soap. And the last thing I have are the dried flowers that I'm going to be topping off this soap with. The flowers I have were gifted to me from a friend from her mom's garden. Her mom's garden is all the way in Jordan, so it's pretty special to be able to use these flowers on this soap. I'm not exactly sure what she puts in this, but I know for sure that there are some rose petals and rosebuds in here. I see some kind of purple flower here, and I actually added in these jasmine flowers because the fragrance oil I'm using does have notes of jasmine in it, so I thought it would be good to include those. The next ingredient I have is my lye water solution. You want to be really careful with this stuff because this is caustic and can burn you. And when working with lye, you're going to need to take some protective measures. So I have some safety goggles here that I'll be wearing when I'm making the soap. I also have these rubber gloves. You can use like latex gloves if you want, but I wanted extra protection, so I go for these. You'll also need an immersion blender. You don't want to use one that you use for food. This is my immersion blender that's dedicated to soap making and other craft stuff. I've used this also to make paper. And the same rule goes for all of your other supplies. Don't use stuff that you're going to be eating with. So this is a bowl and spatula that I dedicate just to soap making as well. Another thing that's really helpful to have is a laser thermometer, so that you can check the temperature of your oils and lye water solution because you want them to be a similar temperature. And finally, you will need a soap mold. You don't need one this large, but I make my soap to sell, so I need to make large quantities at a time. And this is nothing special. I actually asked Erin to make this for me out of wood, so it's like a custom size. But you don't need a dedicated mold if you don't have one. If you just want to try this out, you can use a cardboard box, line that with plastic, or what I do is I line my mold with parchment paper. You can also buy inexpensive smaller molds online. I'll link one down below that I started using when I was learning how to make soap in the beginning, and it worked out great for me. A lot of them will have a silicone liner in there as well, so that it's easy for you to unmold your soap afterwards. And I think that's mostly it. One thing I forgot to mention is that you'll need a digital scale to measure out all of your ingredients. And now I'll start by showing you how I made my lye water solution. I'm measuring out some distilled water here. If you're making this for personal use, you can use tap water. That's how I started doing it. The distilled water will just give you a clearer soap and one that will foam up a little nicer as well. Then I'm going to measure out my lye. When you're working with lye, there are certain materials that are safe for using with it, so glass is one of them, so that jar that I have is a dedicated lye jar. And then if you have any container and you look at the recycling number on the bottom, a number 2 or 5 will be safe to use with lye. Once I have both of those ingredients measured out, I'm going to slowly add the lye into the water. This can sometimes form a crust on the bottom if you're working with large amounts, so I like to stir it after every little bit. And you'll notice I also have my jar on a coaster here. This is partly to catch any of those lye particles that don't make it into the jar, but also when the lye hits the water, it is going to create a chemical reaction and the lye will get very hot. So I just like to have the coaster down there just to protect the surface that I'm working on. So I'm adding and stirring. You can see that this is getting a little bit cloudy. You might also want to wear a face mask at this point because this also creates some fumes. Make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area. And you just want to stir and make sure this is all dissolved. Like I mentioned, this is going to form a chemical reaction where it gets really hot. So right now it's at about 200 degrees and it's too hot for us to work with. So I just cover this up and I set it aside in a safe place that's away from any children or pets and where it won't get knocked over. And I usually let this cool down for about 2 hours until it's closer to the temperature I want to work with, which is usually about 90 to 100 degrees. I'm also going to wipe down the area with a damp rag just to catch any of those loose lye particles because I don't want those hanging around. While this lye mixture is cooling down, I like to prep a lot of the other things that I need to do for the soap. So one of these is to line my soap mold. I line my soap mold with parchment paper, so I just have to cut that out to fit each time, and I just secure that down with thumbtacks. And the other thing I do is measure out all of my oils and get those melted down as well, which I didn't do on camera this time, but you can see it here. And my oils are at 88 degrees, and I'm gonna take the temperature of my lye right now. And you want your oils and your lye to be within 10 degrees of each other. So right now that lye is still a little bit too hot. While I wait, I'm going to take that rose clay that I'm going to be coloring my soap with and pull some of that oil out before we add the lye to it. I'm just going to take a couple of tablespoons of that. It doesn't really matter how much because this is just the pre-measured amount of oil that I'm using for the batch. And I just want to use it to disperse that clay so that later on it's easier to blend into the entire batch. So I actually ended up going ahead and putting my oils in the microwave for about 30 seconds just to warm it up a little bit more. Anything between room temperature to like 110 degrees will be a good temperature to be working with. But again, you just want to make sure the oils and the lye are within 10 degrees. So now everything's good to go. I'm going to get my immersion blender and put it into my oil mixture, and I'm going to slowly and carefully pour in the lye water mixture. You want to make sure you are not splashing this so that it doesn't splash on your skin and cause any burns. And I'm going to start by slowly swirling this around with the stick of my immersion blender while it's not on. And at this point, I usually like to tap it along the bottom to release any air bubbles that are trapped under there as well. And then I'm going to slowly start turning it on in short bursts. So I'll turn it on for a few seconds and let that pulse and then release it and just stir it manually while it's not on. You can see how immediately those oils and lye water are going to emulsify into this really creamy, beautiful liquid. And it's going to get thicker the more that you let this run with the immersion blender on. And I'm showing this to you in real time without cutting anything out because I want to show you how very little you need to turn this immersion blender on. I think a common beginner mistake is to blend this too much and then it gets too thick because it'll continue to thicken over time, and then later on when you try to pour it, it's going to be very difficult or even impossible to pour. Before this gets too thick, I'm going to add my colorants right now. So I'm putting just a little bit of titanium dioxide, which is a natural white colorant, and then I'm also going to add in that clay that I dispersed earlier and just use a spatula to scrape out any of those little bits. If you're adding things like clays and that titanium dioxide, this will also thicken up your mixture and make it come up to trace a little faster. So that's another reason that I like to leave my mixture a little bit on the thin side before I add these in. Once I have those colorants added in, I'm going to blend this up just a little bit longer because those colors really need a little bit of that immersion blender power to get them all mixed in nicely. I'm going to blend this just until those colors are mixed in nicely, and I really don't want to blend this too much. I want it to be at a super light trace because I'm going to start adding my fragrance oil now, and I've worked with this one before and I know that it can accelerate and even rice the mixture. So I like to add this in while I'm whisking. And again, I'm showing you this part in real time so that you can see that once I add this in, this mixture is going to thicken up very quickly. Using a floral fragrance is definitely not something that I would suggest to beginners because a lot of them are a little difficult to work with. If you are making an unscented soap or a different fragrance oil that doesn't accelerate your mixture, at this point you can go in with your immersion blender and keep blending this until it's at like a pudding consistency. But just with the hand whisking, once I have that fragrance oil in, it's accelerating to the point where it's pretty much ready to pour at this point. You'll know when your mixture is ready because if you pull up your whisk or spatula, whatever you're using to mix, it'll leave a little bit of a trail. So my mixture is pretty much ready to go here. Before it gets too thick, I go ahead and pour that into the mold and try to get it as even as possible. And right now is the perfect time to work on a little bit of a design and add the dried flowers on top. To make a little bit of a zigzag design, I'm taking a fork and just making little zigzag patterns. And once that's done, I'm going to add in my dried flowers on just one side of the soap and make sure I lightly press that in with my gloved hands. You don't want to touch this wet mixture with your bare hands, and just press that in so that all of the flowers are nicely embedded in there. You really don't need a lot to make it look really pretty, but you also want to put just a little bit more than you want in the final product, because some of this will fall off as it dries and when you go to cut it. Once you're fully done pouring and decorating and all that stuff, what I like to do is put this into a cardboard box and cover it with a blanket, which will just help insulate the heat. The box I showed you doesn't actually fit this mold. Usually I just put this large mold into a cooler that insulates the heat really nicely. And then you'll just want to let it sit there for 1 to 2 days. Here is what the soap looks like after 2 days. So now we're just going to pull it out of the mold and cut it into bars. It's really easy to just take this out with the parchment paper liner. And I love how this soap came out. That pink color is gorgeous and perfect for this floral soap, and I love that topping with the dried flowers on top. My batches of soap are 5 pounds, so this is a pretty hefty loaf of soap right here, and for me this will make about 16 bars. To cut your soap, there are specific soap cutting tools that you can buy. One of them is like this bench scraper kind of thing, but you can also just use a knife, which is what I'm going to do today. And you can also get a miter box, and this will help you just to cut even and straight bars. This is one that Erin actually made for me, and your soap cutter tool just goes into the slots so that it's really easy to cut bars of the same shape. For this particular loaf, I can't use this miter box because anytime you have big toppings like this, if you cut from the top down, it's going to create drag marks as your knife or tool goes down into the soap bar, and it's not going to look very nice. So what I have to do for this loaf is to turn it onto its side with the flower side towards the bottom, and instead of cutting from the top down, I'm going to cut from side to side. And I want to make sure that my bars are even, so I'm going to go ahead and take out a ruler and mark out 1-inch lines just so that I can get my bars to the same size and shape. But again, if you're just doing this for personal use, you can cut them into whatever size and shape, and it doesn't matter if they're even or not. And now it's time to cut into the bars, and this is probably the best part of soap making. This time is the perfect time to cut because the bars have hardened a little bit, but they're still soft enough that it's kind of like cutting into cold butter, and it's really satisfying. So each bar is going to have a little bit of that zigzag design and a little bit of the dried flowers topping, and the inside is just that beautiful pastel pink. And this is also really fun if you're doing some kind of soap that has like a swirl design or something cool inside, because usually you don't know how it turned out until you cut into the bars. So it's always like an exciting little reveal. Here are all the soap bars all cut and lined up. Once you're done cutting your soap, you can't use it right away. You actually have to let this cure for 30 days. And what this means is you just put it on a shelf, something with airflow, leave a little bit of gap in between the bars like they are right here, and just let it sit there for 30 days. This is going to make sure that any of that lye reacted and absorbed into the soap so that it's safe to use. And mostly this is just to create a really hard and long-lasting bar of soap, because this is probably safe to use after a few days. But if you do use these right away, the bars are going to be very soft and probably disintegrate in the shower. So once you let it cure for at least 30 days, it will be a nice, hard, long-lasting bar of soap. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. You will probably be watching this after these bars have already cured, so they'll be up on our Etsy shop. I'll leave the link in the description box so you can check it out, and you can buy a bar of soap from this exact batch if you would like to. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.